New York City, April 30th, 1789. To tumultuous cheers, a few simple words echo across America.
I, George Washington, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President.
At Federal Hall, George Washington becomes the first President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
A new Constitution, a new President, a new nation. But just hundreds of miles away, other nations lay dying. The pain of their people comes from the death grip that crushed them between Great Britain and its American colonies as patriots fought the revolution that won the United States its independence. They are the Haudenosaunee, a name meaning people of the Longhouse, better known as the Iroquois. The nations of the Iroquois Confederacy had been a powerful, influential force in colonial America. Their diplomatic and military skills, their numbers and unity had given them enormous strength. Now that unity was undone, their mighty league lay in tatters.
This revolution was about honor. You know, and freedom, and dignity, and the rights of man. And here they were just absolutely pushing us off of our lands and starving us.
George Washington is called the father of his country. The Iroquois had another name for him, Lanadagalis, destroyer of towns. The waters of Niagara, New York State. We think of this as the East, but in the early days of the first European colonists, this was part of the western frontier. To understand how the West was lost, you can begin at places in the East, like Niagara. Hundreds of years before Europeans ever set foot here, the territory that is now New York was a place of unending, extraordinary beauty. Mountains, lakes, rivers, streams, mile after mile of thick forest and wild grass. But it was not a land of peace. The Iroquois people who live here are in turmoil, divided by war, trapped in violent, vicious blood feuds.
It was a time when our people simply were afraid to look into the next day for fear of what they would see. And there wasn't any hope at that point. It was a time when our men were abusing our women. Our women were abusing our children. It was a terrible, terrible period in our history.
According to Iroquois tradition, salvation arrives in the form of a prophet, an Indian man of virgin birth called the Peacemaker. He travels from native settlement to settlement, preaching a gospel of world peace. The Peacemaker brings a message from the Creator. There will be a new world for the Iroquois, a world in which the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, will unite in a league of harmony and security.
He did things like he took one arrow, and he broke it. And when he broke it, it showed the people how easily each of their individual nations could be broken. Then he tied 5 arrows together and tried to break that bundle, but he couldn't do it. And he said that's how we'll be. If we unify and we're united as this bundle of 5 arrows is, then we'll be strong.
The Iroquois heed the Peacemaker's message and unite in a powerful league dedicated to peace. The 5 nations of this new Iroquois confederacy are the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Mohawks. Before leaving, the Peacemaker warns the 5 nations never to return to their former violent ways.
If you chiefs by the council fire should be continually throwing ashes at one another, your people will go astray. Their heads will roll. Authority will be gone. Your enemies then may see that your minds are scattered. The league will be at a standstill, and the good news of peace and power will be unable to proceed.
Committed to peace, the Iroquois enter an era of prosperity. Men are able to hunt without fear. Women, who are treated as esteemed equals in Iroquois society, can oversee the growing of sacred corn, beans, and squash. It is a time when the Iroquois live in harmony with each other and their land.
In the terminology that we have with the Haudenosaunee, we call her Itinoha, our mother, because the land gives life.
But life for the Haudenosaunee is about to take a dangerous and dramatic turn. July 1609. French explorer Samuel de Champlain and a war party of Huron and Algonquin Indians come down from Canada to raid the Mohawks. It is the Iroquois' first hostile encounter with the whites from across the ocean.
And the Mohawks, it's recorded that they were wearing wooden slatted armor and that they were in massed formation.
From the journals of Samuel de Champlain.
I marched on until I was within some 30 yards of the enemy, who, as soon as they caught sight of me, halted and gazed at me, and I at them. When I saw them make a move to throw their bows upon us, I took aim with my arquebus and shot straight at one of the 3 chiefs.
Well, they watched in horror as the musket balls just cut right through wooden armor and watched several of the party die. So while the French had a brief victory, it introduced the Mohawks to people who would shoot first and ask questions later.
The French just somehow didn't understand that making peace and allies of the Iroquois would have been a better idea. Instead, they made them as enemies. But of course, this was all over the fur trade.
Beaver pelts, prized in Europe for elegant beaver hats are what the French are after, and they rely on their Huron and Algonquin allies to help get them. In exchange, the Indians receive metal utensils, blankets, and firearms. The Iroquois know that to stay alive, they too must get guns, make alliances, become players in the fur trade. They turn to a rival of the French, the Dutch, whose settlements are steadily growing nearby.
If they do not get guns from the Dutch, they will be overwhelmed. The only way they can get guns from the Dutch is to participate in the fur trade with the Dutch as partners and to begin to expand into the lands necessary to obtain the beaver pelts for the fur trade. So it becomes like an arms race.
The French wrestle with the Iroquois and the Dutch for control of the fur trade. At the same time, Jesuit missionaries arrive among the people of the Five Nations, preaching both for God and country, the country of France. The Jesuit black robes bring more with them than the word of their God. They also bring killers, influenza and smallpox.
They were confused. They were frightened. They were terrified by this thing that they didn't understand. And they, of course, associated the suffering with the arrival of the people from the East.
The Iroquois defend themselves against what they believe is Jesuit witchcraft. Missionaries are seized and forced to endure excruciating tortures. One of those captured is Father Francisco Bressani.
I was all drenched and covered with blood that streamed from every part of my body, and exposed to a very cold wind that made it congeal immediately to my skin. But I consoled myself, seeing that God granted me the favor of suffering in this world some pain, in place of what I was under obligation on account of my sins, to pay in the other, with torments incomparably greater.
The violence escalates. The Iroquois declare war on the French and their Indian allies. The Hurons, longtime enemies of the Iroquois and devoted friends of the French, are hammered by the wrath of the Haudenosaunee. By 1650, the Hurons are nearly wiped out. But the Iroquois victory is not without cost. Sickness and warfare have exhausted them as well. The forests are depleted of precious beaver. Life for the Haudenosaunee has forever changed. The great law of peace has been stained with blood.
But what I think we are looking for is peace at that point in time. We are looking for an end to these wars that have been taking so much resources, so much human life, and so much of our time. So what you want to do then is to get on the side of initiating. You want to get on the side of initiating treaties that form a peace so that you can begin to get control of your environment again and get control of your life.
To regain control, the Iroquois Confederacy looked south along the Hudson River. In 1664, the Dutch surrender their American territory to the British, who rename it New York. Traditional enemies of the French, the English are quick to recognize the advantages of an alliance with the Iroquois. Called the Covenant Chain, this relationship will determine the fate of North America.
I think they came to grips with the knowledge that that they either accommodate this permanent presence or they fight with it, and there was no guarantee that they could win this fight. As a matter of fact, I think they realized they couldn't.
As the 17th century comes to a close, the Iroquois Confederacy is able to negotiate a peace with both France and England. Successful for decades, it is a delicate balancing act, but ultimately an impossible one. (1710). 3 Mohawk ambassadors and a representative of the Mohican people are taken on a fantastic journey, a voyage of diplomacy across the sea to London. They are presented to the royal court of Queen Anne as the kings of the 5 nations.
City. They saw the scope of another way of looking at the world, and I'm certain they came back moved by it. Geez, this is these people are giants.
The spectacle of these so-called 4 kings going to England, I think is a perfect piece of evidence that the English needed them.
The Iroquois world continues to change. In 1713, a 6th nation comes into their confederacy, the Tuscaroras, joining the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. But as the size of the League expands, even greater is the colonial population explosion. White farms and homes are spreading pell-mell into Indian lands. The Iroquois protest to the British, but it is difficult for the royal government to stifle the land lust of the American settlers.
They were perplexed by them, they were astounded by them. My grandmother told me how they viewed the white man coming. They said, was it like a black cloud rolling? A black cloud rolling over the land. And it brought death, brought pestilence, and it brought a great deal of tragedy and grief to our people.
(1754). Britain and France are at war in North America. The French are supported by fighters from the Delaware and Shawnee nations. The English have their Iroquois allies. It is a long, bloody fight the British call the French and Indian War. Many settlers are killed or taken prisoner. One of them will lead a remarkable life among the Senecas. In 1758, 15-year-old Mary Jemison and her family are captured by a party of French and Shawnees. The others are executed, but Mary is spared. She is brought to the Senecas and adopted by 2 Seneca women to replace a dead brother.
During my adoption, I sat motionless, nearly terrified to death at the appearance and actions of the company, expecting every moment to feel their vengeance and suffer death on the spot. I was, however, happily disappointed when at the close of the ceremony the company retired and my sisters went about employing every means for my consolation and comfort.
The war that has so shaken Mary Jemison's life has also shaken the Iroquois' ability to remain neutral. In frustration, Red Head, an Oneida chief, complains.
We don't know what you Christians, French and English together intend. We are so hemmed in by both that we hardly have a hunting place left. We are so perplexed between both that we hardly know what to say or think.
Redhead's complaint is addressed to a man who has enormous influence with the Iroquois Confederacy, Sir William Johnson. The British Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Johnson is a close friend of the Mohawks. He speaks their language and marries an influential Mohawk woman named Molly Brant. Together, they have several children. In councils with the Iroquois at his mansion, Johnson Hall, Sir William urges them to stand firm with England.
Stand by your brethren the English. Don't break your covenant chain. Let not the French boastings deceive you. The English are slow to spill blood, but when they begin, they are like an angry wolf, and the French will fly before them like deer.
(1763). Johnson's prediction comes true. The French surrender, and Canada becomes part of the British Empire. But the elimination of the French threat only feeds the settlers' hunger for more and more land, Iroquois land. The British issue a proclamation barring white settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains. This greatly angers the colonials. To appease them, the British negotiate a treaty with the Iroquois at Fort Stanwix, New York. In exchange for an Indian white boundary, the Iroquois agreed to cede vast territory in central New York, Pennsylvania, and other lands to the south. It still doesn't satisfy the American colonials.
And so they saw these lines established by proclamation and by treaty as cutting off a real sense of opportunity, a denial of their liberty. So to deny them access to that land was to deny them, in a sense, their liberty. And this would feed into this growing revolutionary debate, this revolutionary crisis that would explode in the 1770s.
March 5th, 1770. British redcoats open fire on a rock-throwing mob, killing 5 in what Americans are quick to call the Boston Massacre.
Give me liberty, or give me death.
The crisis has been simmering for years, but comes to a head when the British clamp down on American freedoms and try to eradicate the huge debts caused by the French and Indian War. They tax American settlers on everything from printed documents to sugar to tea. The colonials decry the taxes and other new British laws as unjust. The Boston Tea Party, at which the Sons of Liberty dressed themselves as Mohawks, was just one of the many protests stirring the American colonies.
And it was explained to the Iroquois that it was a fight between the father and children. The father was the King of England, and the American colonies were the children. And the Iroquois responded, well, then that's a family quarrel, and there's no need for us to be involved, so we'll stay neutral.
But once again, the Iroquois find themselves pulled from both sides in a furious political tug-of-war. The British and the American patriots vie for their allegiance. Many Oneidas and Tuscaroras have come under the influence of a powerful pro-patriot missionary named Samuel Kirkland. They walk miles to hear his anti-British sermons.
He was the one who convinced them the Americans were going to win this land in this war, and if they should be on the winning side, and that should be with the Americans.
The British also have their powerful advocates. Sir William Johnson has died, but his widow's brother, the Mohawk Joseph Brand, has taken his place as a dynamic defender of the crown. Charismatic, a born leader, well-educated, Brand speaks fluent English and at least 3 of the 6 nations' languages. To the British, his support is crucial.
I think he allied himself with the people who he and everybody else reasonably expected to be the winners in this war, which was the English.
Most Iroquois desperately pray that war will not come.
The Haudenosaunee are saying, we love you both. We are friends with the colonies and Britain. That it is a quarrel between you and not us. We don't want your war in our country.
April 19, 1775. Guns open fire on Lexington Green. The shot heard round the world roars like thunder through the 6 nations.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
July 4th, 1776. America declares its independence. Whatever joy these words give the American patriots cannot be shared by the Iroquois. For them, the revolution will mean only more pain. Their confederacy is being ripped apart.
What the Confederacy said at that time is, we will remain neutral. We will not fight as the Haudenosaunee, as a confederacy, nor will we fight as a nation. But we cannot, being free people, deny the right to fight of anyone who wants to, of our men.
Summer, 1777. The American War for Independence rages across the Northeast, dividing families and friends. Reluctantly, the Iroquois have chosen sides. The Oneidas and Tuscaroras will fight for the Americans. But Joseph Brand has convinced some of the Mohawk and Seneca men to fight for their lands and against the Americans. The peacemaker's prophetic warning is coming true.
If you chiefs by the council fire should be continually throwing ashes at one another, your people will go astray. Their heads will roll. Authority will be gone.
In the fire of war, the nations are throwing ashes at one another. They have strayed from the path of peace. August 6th. At Oriskany, in the woods of upstate New York, an American relief column is ambushed by British troops, Senecas, and Mohawks. Fighting alongside the Americans are 60 Oneidas.
It was on this ground here that Oneidas shot at their relatives, the Senecas and the Mohawks, and the Mohawks and Senecas did likewise, and blood was spilled, and Oneidas were killed, and Mohawks were killed, and Senecas were killed.
And then all of a sudden you're there in the midst of battle and you realize you've made these commitments to these nations, that are not even your nation. And you end up fighting against your own brothers.
When we talk about blood, musket balls, a musket ball, about that big. When one of those things hits your flesh, it opens up a huge hole. And so it might enter here, and by the time, if it did exit your body, it would leave a hole like that. So just the nature of the wounds that people had, an incredible amount of blood. A man they call Black Snake later on would talk about how the creek ran red, with blood.
From there, it deteriorated from a battle involving muskets to one involving spears and clubs and axes and knives. And it became the most personal, intimate kind of fight you can imagine. People rushing at each other, neighbor fighting neighbor. And the battle continued like that for some hours.
When the fighting at Oriskany ends, more than 500 lie dead. Some are Oneidas. Many more are Senecas and Mohawks.
Dreams that people had, that efforts that they had made to carry on the idea of the peacemaker was violated here in the most personal way. When you begin to murder and kill other Iroquois people, that means that we've surrendered the central part of our lives and the central idea of our lives. The message of the peacemaker was such that we should live in peace and harmony with each other. And here at Oriskany, that idea was breached.
Summer, 1778. Joseph Brant avenges the slaughter at Oriskany. With British support, he leads the Senecas and Mohawks on a bloody campaign against their Oneida cousins and their American allies.
Our Oneida people, during the campaigns of the Revolutionary War, suffered greatly. Our villages were destroyed, our crops and fields and storehouses were destroyed and burned, and we suffered as a result. And so our people, of course, had very strained times, very hungry times, and very poor times as a result of our loyalty.
And yet, their oral history speaks of how Chief Shenandoah and other Oneidas risked death to feed General George Washington's starving Continental Army during that terrible winter at Valley Forge.
Shenandoah and a group of Oneidas walked to Valley Forge with several hundred bushels of corn. Oral tradition goes that if it weren't for this one saving act, that one deed of kindness by Shenandoah and his men that brought the bushels of corn to Valley Forge, that we'd probably be living under British rule.
1779. Attacks by Joseph Brant and other pro-British Iroquois are hampering the flow of food and supplies to the Continental Army. And exaggerated reports of Indian massacres have the American public clamoring for action. George Washington decides to go on the offensive.
Washington concluded that he could end this problem by destroying Iroquois itself. This was a kind of campaign of destruction that he didn't carry out in any other part of America. And it seemed to violate, fundamental rules of conventional warfare.
Washington takes special aim at the troublesome Senecas.
The object will be effectually to chastise and intimidate the hostile nations, to cut off their next year's crops, and do them every other mischief which time and circumstance will permit. The country must not be merely overrun, but destroyed. You will listen to no overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effected.
August 26, 1779. More than 5,000 men and officers under the command of New Hampshire General John Sullivan set out from Tioga, Pennsylvania. There is virtually no resistance to Sullivan's campaign. The American soldiers are astounded by the beauty and bounty of the Seneca homeland.
When they arrive in the Seneca country, they find these beautiful homes. They find the finest cornfields. They find the finest orchards of peaches and apples. And what they do is they set fire to everything, anything that can sustain life. They burn it. They kill whomever they find in their path, and they burn the houses to the ground. They cut the corn down. They set fire to all of the corn. They destroy anything that is edible.
What Sullivan was doing and was ordered by Washington was to scorch the earth. And its essence, it's saying to, the message being sent to the Haudenosaunee is, we plan to wipe out your families. We will starve you to death.
Mary Jamison, the adopted white sister of the Senecas, watches in horror.
A part of our corn they burned and threw the remainder into the river. They burnt our houses, killed what cattle and horses they could find, destroyed our fruit trees, and left nothing but the bare soil and timber.
And this is where, to me, must have been the lowest period in our history, where we were reduced to starvation. To think of these proud people who had 100-acre, 200-acre cornfields and 1,500 fruit trees were now, in just the space of a month or two of Sullivan, were destitute.
From the diary of General Sullivan.
The number of towns destroyed by this army amounted to 40, besides scattering houses. The quantity of corn destroyed at a modest computation must amount to 160,000 bushels, with a vast quantity of vegetables of every kind. I flatter myself that the orders of which I was entrusted are fully executed.
Many of the Senecas flee west to safety near Britain's Fort Niagara. But Sullivan's destruction hasn't annihilated the Senecas and the other Iroquois. His flames only have enraged them even more. They are prepared to fight the Americans forever. But then comes staggering news. October 1781. On a battlefield in Yorktown, Virginia, the British surrender to Washington. The English persuade their Iroquoian allies to lay down their arms. The revolution is over, they say. We have lost. To the Iroquois, the world is turned irrevocably upside down.
I think they also must have started to realize that they were kind of used, and that what meant the most to them, they were about to lose. And they didn't know, what their future would hold. It's an emptiness and a pain, and it's hard to describe, but I'm sure that's how they felt.
Joseph Brant said he felt that he and his people were between two hells. War was one hell. Peace would be another. (1783). For the first time in nearly 8 years, there is peace in the lands of the Iroquois. The Treaty of Paris officially ends the Revolutionary War between Great Britain and the new United States. In it, there is not a single word on the fate of the Iroquois. No matter which side each of the 6 nations fought for, it is as if they never existed.
They no longer mattered, really, in any real terms, and they could be brushed aside. And I think that was the cruelest lesson that the Iroquois Confederacy had to learn, is that they had been treated as simply another political tool. And when their usefulness was up, they were discarded and thrown aside.
The war a thing of the past, the American push westward resumes in reckless earnest. Speculators are selling off land they don't even own. Many of General Sullivan's men plan moves to the western New York territory they had ravaged just a few years before.
Essentially, all of those who served saw that land as American land, almost as if it was a birthright. They saw their destiny in the West, and they would take that up either by right of conquest or through coercion and fraud. And that's exactly what happened.
Joseph Brant and his Mohawk followers are given refuge in British Canada. Most of the other Iroquois are moved to small reservations in New York State. Ironically, sided with the victorious Americans who perhaps were worse. New York State takes a tiny their homeland. People had put their lives on the line for George Washington during their legendary visit to Valley Forge. This was Shenandoah's bitter reward.
There was a speech just before he died where he said, "I'm an aged hemlock. The winds of 100 years have whistled
through my branches. The generation to which I have belonged have run away and left me."
It's a very sad way to go.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility.
In my opinion, it was a lose-lose situation. Both powers intended to own the continent. And what the native people thought of that conquest was really not of much consequence. As we look back, we can see that the colonial aims to empire were realized.
Today, most Iroquois still believe and follow the non-violent teachings of the peacemaker. So strong is their faith, in 1993, a peace delegation came to share the peacemaker's great law with the United Nations. But some still do not hear his words. In 1990, a protest over disputed lands adjacent to a Mohawk reserve in Canada explodes in violence. The standoff between the Mohawks and the Canadian military lasts 11 tense weeks. To escape such violence, a group of Mohawks is moving back to the lands of their ancestors. They have bought a former county nursing home with 300 acres of land by the Mohawk River in upstate New York. After more than 200 years, these Iroquois people are finally home. Here they will try to make the dream of the peacemaker a reality.
If we all just took the time to sit and talk with one another and share our ideas and our beliefs, that we'd find that we have more in common than we have differences. I think that we can all maybe someday work side by side to create that great, great peace that the peacemaker may have been dreaming of for everybody.